Hello, Mr. Manuelium. You finally answered my missives through a YouTube video. So I must return the messages. I think we are reinventing voice memos, you and I. Except slightly more cinematic, so we're really on the cutting edge of technology here. I've also rigged up the world's most DIY pop filter, I think is what I am going to call it. It is very bad, but I do think it is making the plosives a bit better, so let me know if it works out. But yes, I've dusted off this speed paint that I made a little while ago. I wanted to make a new wallpaper background for my desktop, and I was feeling sunflowers, so let's see. Lately, I have mostly been reeling from a really well-written fanfic that I found. It was an Omori and Genshin Impact crossover of all things that, I really absolutely did not think would work. But then I cried for 4 chapters, so it absolutely did work on me. I think this fic might also be the most untalk-aboutable fic that I could have possibly found, because on one hand it's Genshin Impact, which no one cares for. I don't even care for Genshin Impact, and I'm the one talking about it right now. And the second half is Omori, which I'm trying so hard not to spoil, because both you and Jenna have expressed interest in playing it, but haven't actually gotten around to fully playing it, so I just cannot say a singular thing about this fic, content-wise. I can go into no details at all. But yes, the first half, I had such a capricious, dichotomatic, that can't be a word, but the first half of the fic did not work for me at all. It was just highlighting the worst of both texts to me, and reminded me a lot of why Omori never really worked for me, you know? I have the same problem with Omori as I did with In Stars and Time, where the work in question is pretty well done, and it goes over a lot of quote-unquote mature topics, but all the characters are either literally children or very young adults, and it just lends this air of not quite immaturity, but not maturity. Some secret third option, I guess, where everything feels kind of naive or simplified. I still haven't quite nailed down the exact word for it yet, but it really came into focus for me, both during the first half of this fic and also after I'd written my In Stars and Time fanfic, and I was thinking about writing I'm always thinking about writing that Pathologic 2 fanfic, but one of these days I'll get around to actually writing it. But both of those works have a lot of they share a surprising amount of thematic overlap, just because they're both concerned with time loops and theater motifs. In Stars and Time, obviously, it goes harder in on the time loops, but they're surprisingly similar for 2 very disparate games. And I did think a lot about how they just have such different tones, though, is the thing. You can really tell that In Stars and Time skews very young, I guess. In Stars and Time is hip with the kids, you know? It knows the cool TikTok slang, it knows, Fortnite dances. It's up to date on YouTuber discourse, whereas Pathologic 2 was, an adult man who pays taxes and needs to get a refill on their antidepressants, you know, has old friends with capital O and capital F that they have history with a capital H history, you know, I think for both Omori and In Stars and Time, the fact that it skews so young, both in you know, its cast of characters, as well as presumably its a targeted demographic, I think it does kind of undercut itself a little. Like, it can never get as deep as it seems to want with its own themes, because it is... shallow's not quite the right word for it. Surface level, skin deep, something of that concept cluster of just... it feels like you can't really talk about it because you're talking to a child, and you shouldn't talk about these things to a child, you know? Or like, not in... you wouldn't use the same language to speak of it, at the very least. I don't know, it's I haven't quite pinned it down yet. I'll send you another video essay when I do, I suppose. But yes, I was truly just not very impressed with the first half of the fic. It was not working for me. But then, like, almost literally exactly halfway on, like, chapter 4 out of 8, I realized that I had in fact made a critical error in my assumptions of how exactly the Amori plotline was being grafted onto the Genshin story, and I just, like, I think I may have cried through the rest of the fic. I realized that, like, the author did in fact have the balls to take the much more tragic version of the narrative that I didn't think they would have the balls to do it. But then, like, because of it, like, the story just snapped together for me. Like, everything worked. All the themes and motifs just slotted into place. Suddenly, like, both works were covering for the other's weaknesses, and the fic made me retroactively like Amori more. Because as much as I respect Amori as, like, it executes well on its own premise, it is, you know, it does exactly what it sets out to do, I just personally didn't like that much, as, like, it just wasn't to my taste, you know? But the second half of the story really, it reminded me that, like, Amori did work, though, like, all the good parts of it. I shan't spoil any of the details, but I think the beating heart, the ticking infernal engine that makes the narrative of Amori turn is that, at its heart, it's just a really well done tragedy. And I can't knock that, even with all my English major critiques, you know? Like, it manages to be a like, big, heavy sort of tragedy without being so over the top as to invite a sarcastic reading and just take us over the line into edginess. Which I think is what happens to a lot of other works, like Tokyo Ghoul, for example, my beloved, but the anime has certainly failed that, and just, like, with Amori, it's like, it's a huge and horrible thing that has happened, but it's not... It is sort of in the style of, like, Death of a Salesman, where it's a very ordinary tragedy, it's a very everyday sort of thing. It's so plain that you can't really escape the edges through irony. It's just very simply... It's just very simply sad. And I think, like, one of the greatest things that a fan work can do is to make you think better of its parent work, to elevate the canon it came from in your eyes, you know? Like, or the other way around, if it's also one of the greatest things a fan work can do is to completely tear down its parent work and spit on its grave, but... But yes, I've been ruminating on that fic ever since. I've been meaning to write the next chapter of my own fanfic, but this crossover has put me in a very tragic mood, and it's really not the tone of the story, so I gotta switch gears before I can really get back into it, you know? But yeah, I think there's I hope I can do the same with my own work, to have a crossover where both texts can be leaned against each other such that they cover for each other's weaknesses, and amplify the good parts of each, you know? Though I've also... there's the other style of writing, crossovers, which is... there's a handful of, like, Full Metal Alchemist and Harry Potter crossovers, actually, that I think are taking the exact opposite approach of, like, trying to turn two pieces of canon on each other like dogs in a fighting ring. Because the world building of Full Metal Alchemist is just so airtight. It is, like, the magic system of alchemy is basically science. It's basically Newton's laws, you know? Whereas Harry Potter runs entirely on vibes and doesn't even run, really. And so whenever people put those two together, it's mostly just to watch Full Metal Alchemist chew up Harry Potter and grind into dust beneath its heels before spitting it out. Watching all the sparks fly as the two magic systems meet each other, and Harry Potter just kind of crumbles apart like a day-old cookie. And that too is a style of crossover and is quite entertaining to watch, in the same way that watching a dog tear apart a small rodent is entertaining, you know? Like, it's certainly a style. I will say, I do think there's a certain brand of critique against Harry Potter that I think is not, well... I think the people who critique Harry Potter's magic system for being a soft magic system instead of being a hard magic system are kind of missing the point at the beginning, at least, because, like, the magic system is very obviously meant to just, like, establish a sense of whimsy and childlike wonder in this world, you know? Like, you wave your wand and it does little fireworks and stuff, and, like, it's not really meant to hold up to scrutiny from a scientific perspective. That's not really... This is a story where the headmaster is named fucking Dumbledore. This is not that kind of story. These are not the questions you should be asking. But on the other hand, increasingly as the series goes on, it does become that kind of story, because it becomes a weirdly serious war story, where, like, you're fighting the metaphor Nazis. And in that sort of situations, it's like, well, okay, this information is relevant now. How exactly does magic work? We are fighting with it. We are engaging in combat with it. People are dying to it. In which case, we need to have a very clear set of rules of what is and is not possible in order for our readers not to feel cheated. And at that point, Harry Potter falls apart completely, but it was already not... It was never good. It was all... So... But yeah, I think about the kinds of engagement a story encourages and the kind of questions you should be asking a lot. Because, like, this is in the context of, you know, writing my little worm My Hero fic. And the worm fandom is very... they're what I would... In my head, I label it as, like, Reddit atheist tendencies. Like, rationalists, sort of, like... the sort of actually kind of people, where whenever in a lot of Worm itself and in its derived fan works, there's the general audience engagement tends to follow the lines of, like, actually this character's power works like this, as evidenced in chapter 3.5, so they should have done this instead of bringing down the villain, you know, like, oh, why didn't they just do this, you know? It's very, like, why didn't the eagles just fly the ring of power to Mordor kind of stuff. And it's like, that's not the kind of engagement that I am interested in as an author, but also I do think it is the correct way to engage in Worm in its own way. Like, you know, with Lord of the Rings, when you ask, like, why didn't they fly the ring to the eagles? It's like, in fiction, the answer is something like, oh, because the eagles would have been tempted by the ring, or because the eagles would not have, you know, there's all these reasons you could have come up with. But, like, the real answer, the metatextual answer is like, well, that's not really what the story is about. Like, the ring is very obviously a metaphor. The real way you defeat the evil isn't it is through, like, technically through getting the ring to toss in a volcano, but really it's through assembling the fellowship and all of these disparate peoples coming together in this moment of need, you know? It's about Legolas and Gimli overcoming their fantasy racism, and that itself is a metaphor for, like, the greater sort of, like, elvish/dwarvish relationships. I'm so tired of high fantasy. If I have to see another elf, I'm gonna murder some. Don't worry about that. That was a tangent. But, like, point is, at the end of the day, it's like, the Eagles can't fly the ring to Mordor because that's not what this story's about, and if they did that, there would be no more story. You know, like, you're asking the wrong questions. Whereas with Worm, I think a question like why didn't they just fly the ring to Mordor with eagles is exactly the question that you are supposed to be asking. That is exactly the kind of engagement that the story encourages, because it is a story about characters who are constantly trying to find loopholes, who are trying to find the way to get the, ways to get the ring to Mordor without actually having to walk it there on foot. It is about this kind of, like, utilization of resources in a very clever way, that, like, encourages that kind of nitpicky sort of way of approaching its world. And so in this case, like, as much as I find it sort of uninteresting and at times kind of annoying, I do think all the people who are like, well, why didn't Eidolon just do this? Why didn't Taylor use her powers? Like, that is the way you are supposed to engage with Worm. That is the kind of questions its story leads you to ask. Like, if I'm telling you a fairy tale, then the details don't really matter all that much, because that's just not what the genre convention is. The overarching shape of the narrative is the important bit, the moral at the end is the important bit. But if I tell you a story that's mostly a logic puzzle with superpowers and trying to use everything you have at your disposal to defeat each other, then, like, in that case you do actually need all of the rules and the details spelled out, because, like, that's just the bit, that is the premise of the game, you know? In fact, I think that's one of Worm's greatest strengths, is that, like, Worm, 90% of the time, in fact, 98% of the time, Worm has a really interesting answer to why the Eagles cannot fly the ring to Mordor built into its world building. That's just the way that story is structured. Like, it does so much to justify itself, and, like, if it had failed at any point, then the entire thing would have come crumbling down like a house of cards, but it didn't. Like, the author just put enough thought into the world building and, like, into the justifications for, like, why all these common superhero tropes exist in this world in a really interesting way that, like, it works. Like, it makes you believe that we can't fly the ring to Mordor, and, like, here's why, and here's how it ties into every other aspect of the setting, and it's like, it works really well sometimes. But also, the commenters are kind of annoying to me personally, so that is the price, that is the give and take, you know? Ugh. And then My Hero is just kind of worse at world building than Worm is. Like, no offense to My Hero, but I'm sorry, like, the main healer of Worm is a superhero named Panacea, and in My Hero, the main healer is named Recovery Girl, and it's like, one of those names is better than the other one. Like, that's just true. Like, cut some slack for the translation, but, like, Worm has My Hero beat handily, which is why I need to write my goddamn fic where I don't understand why these other fics aren't crossing over into Worm from My Hero instead of the other way around. I think they're all wrong, and I have to write mine. Ah! Okay, I'm getting over time now. Thanks for listening. Until next time,